Denmark Vesey, the slave who planned the Great Rebellion, 1822, Charleston, South Carolina. In the midst of clandestine black churches and secret meetings, a dangerous dream grew: freedom. Denmark Vesey, a man who had bought his manumission, did not forget the brothers and sisters who were still chained. With intelligence and courage, he began to organize what would be one of the greatest planned rebellions against slavery in the United States. Thousands of enslaved were ready to get up, take the city, and gain freedom by force. But the conspiracy was discovered ahead of time. Vesey and dozens of his companions were arrested, tried, and executed. Even so, its name echoes to this day as a symbol of resistance and martyrdom. Before you embark on this story of conspiracy and courage, tell me, where are you watching? This episode took place in Charleston, South Carolina, and the echo of Vesey's resistance crossed the centuries, inspiring future struggles for freedom. For you, Vesey was just a conspirator, or a true hero of resistance. Subscribe to the channel and leave your opinion in the comments. In 1822, Charleston was not just a city. It was a boiling cauldron of social tensions, a theater where human tragedy unfolded daily under the facade of prosperity. Its streets were paved with the stones of wealth, but also stained by the blood and sweat of those who allowed this opulence to flourish. Imposing houses, with their elegant balconies adorned with vines, rose as silent sentries about a cruel reality: that the city was sustained by the curved shoulders of enslaved men and women. Charleston's sounds in 1822 were a symphony of contrasts. The crystal cups in the rich halls was mixed with the rhythmic bang of the streams dragged by those who had no freedom. The suffocating heat of summer was cut occasionally by the salty breeze coming from the port, where merchant ships loaded with cotton and rice aligned, ready to transport the riches of South America to distant markets. The unmistakable smell of the sea mixed with the scent of the spices that permeated the air, while in the dark alleys, the acre odor of sweaty, exhausted bodies was omnipresent. Charleston at the time housed about 24,000 inhabitants, of which almost half was made up of slaves. This numerical disparity, however, was not reflected in power or freedom. Society was rigidly structured in an oppressive hierarchy, where white gentlemen dictated the rules, while slaves were reduced to mere instruments of work, devoid of rights and dignity. The city was a microcosm of the slave system that dominated the South, a system where humanity was bought and sold as a commodity. The technology of the time was rudimentary, but efficient to maintain the desired order by you. Leather whips, iron handcuffs, and the constant threat of brutal punishments were the control tools. Physical violence was only part of oppression. Psychological violence, manifested through the constant fear of family separation or sale to another owner, was a shadow that hovered over all enslaved. Among the cobblestone streets, the tension was palpable. Slaves, despite oppression, maintained a subtle communication network, whispering hopes of freedom through chants and stories shared in the few moments of privacy. It was in this environment of oppression and resistance that Denmark Vesey, a liberated man, planned a rebellion that could turn the world upside down. Vesey, with her keen intelligence and natural charisma, became a symbol of hope for many who longed for freedom. The city, with its imposing mansions and busy streets, was also a fertile field for conspiracy. Vesey took every opportunity to gather men and women who were willing to fight for their freedom. He saw the fragility of the system that kept them chained and was determined to break it. The rebellion he planned was not just an act of despair, but an attempt calculated of justice to all who had suffered under the yoke of slavery. Thus, Charleston in 1822 was not only a scenario of opulence and inequality, but also a city on the brink of potentially violent transformation. The seeds of the rebellion were being planted in the fertile soil of injustice, nourished by the determination of men and women who believed that a better world was possible. While the sun was over the port, dyeing the orange and red sky, an almost palpable tension hovered over the city, like a storm about to explode. The sound of the currents dragged by slaves resonated in Denmark Vesey's ears as a constant reminder of his origin. Born in 1767 in St. Thomas, an island of the Danish Antilles, he was torn from his homeland and sold as a commodity, immersed in the cruelty of the slave trade. The smell of salt water and rot impregnated the basement of the slave ship that transported him to the Americas, a place where hope seemed as far as his lost home. Vesey, then known only as Telemaque, found himself in the hands of Joseph Vesey, a ship captain who soon recognized the exceptional intelligence of the young slave. In Charleston, he was tested, a simple pawn in a power game that could not fully understand at the time. The city streets, with their elegant facades and dark alleys, became his new world, where he learned to maneuver with the cunning of a man who had everything to lose. In 1799, Denmark's luck changed dramatically when he won a lottery. a rare event that allowed him to buy his own freedom for $600. It was an exorbitant sum, but it gave him something that many could only dream of: freedom. However, this freedom came with the bitter taste of injustice that still permeated his life. The city he knew so well was still a cauldron of human suffering, and he, now a free man, felt the weight of the invisible currents that still arrested so many others. Vesey used his freedom not to move away, but to get more involved in the struggle for the emancipation of his still chained brothers and sisters. He became a respected carpenter in the community, but his true work was in building a resistance network, where each hammered wooden nail was an attempt to dismantle systematic oppression. His sharp look at detail, acquired over the years of slavery, now served to a greater purpose. The injustice that Denmark witnessed daily was not just an open wound, but a catalyst. Each suffocated cry of a punished slave, each family shattered by the sale of a member, fed his determination. He watched powerless as his friends, men and women with whom he had shared moments of suffering and hope, were brutally punished for daring to dream freely. The sound of the whips crackling in the air, the metallic smell of spilled blood, and the suffocating heat of the South American were constant companions of their growing indignation. Denmark Vesey was a meticulous and strategic man. He knew he could not act impulsively, for the surveillance of the masters was constant and relentless. Thus, he began to plant the seeds of a carefully planned rebellion. In clandestine meetings, held under the cloak of the night, Vesey inspired others with visions of a future where everyone was free. He spoke eloquently, his natural charisma attracting those who were desperate for change. Vesey's house in Charleston became a meeting place for those who believed in the cause. There, under the wooden walls, the whispers of freedom were shared. Vesey used his carpenter's ability to create secret compartments, where important documents and rebellion plans could be hidden from the curious eyes. Each groundboard, every door of the door, was a reminder that freedom had a price, and he was willing to pay him. Vesey's dream was great, but he knew he needed allies. Thus, he sought the help of men like Peter Poyas, a slave respected for his intelligence and natural leadership. Together, they orchestrated a conspiracy that aimed not only at Charleston's freedom, but a lift that could set the whole South burning. The city, with its cobblestone streets and imposing mansions, would be the scene of such a bold and necessary revolution. However, injustice has always been cunning. The rumors of an imminent rebellion have reached the ears of the slave lords, and the city became a barrel of gunpowder about to explode. Surveillance increased, and the fear of internal betrayals prowled each secret meeting. Vesey felt the increasing pressure, but her determination did not hesitate. He knew that freedom would never be granted. It was necessary to conquer it, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The journey of Denmark Vesey, from slave to free man, but eternally marked by the injustice he had witnessed, was a war against oppression. Charleston, with his contrasting landscapes of wealth and misery, was about to witness an attempt to change the course of history. And while the shadows of the night wrapped the city, Vesey continued to plan, knowing that dawn could bring freedom or destruction. The muffled sounds of murmurs and stealing steps filled the night in Charleston, turning the city into a stage of conspiracy and hope. The shadows of churches and houses served as refuge for Denmark Vesey and their allies, while they carefully weave drama of a rebellion that could change the fate of thousands. Each meeting was carefully planned, with an always vigilant eye in the Lord's suspicious looks and any indication of betrayal. Vesey, with her imposing posture and insightful look, moved through space with the trust of a born leader. His charisma was undeniable, attracting those who were hungry for freedom, as flame attracted moths. At each meeting, he spoke of a future where chains would no longer hold his wrists, where his children could run free under the sun, not fear of being torn from his arms. He painted a picture of freedom with words that penetrated the soul of the listeners, igniting their hearts with an almost palpable passion. Churches, usually a place of spiritual encounter, became sanctuaries of resistance. Under the weak light of the candles, the smell of burning wax mingled with the sweat of the pissed bodies, all attentive to Vesey's words. The wooden walls echoed with the intensity of the feelings shared there. Each sigh and whisper were accompanied by the grinding of the floor tablets, seedlings of a conspiracy that grew every day. People like Peter Poyas, a man whose intelligence was rivaled only by his courage, were always beside Vesey. Poyas, with his firm gaze and voice that sounded like thunder in the midst of the storm, was a natural leader. He knew how to galvanize others, how to turn fear into determination. Together, Vesey and Poyas were like two pillars that supported the dream of freedom, guiding slaves on a dark but full of promises. The meetings were a mix of meticulous planning and silent celebration. Every detail was discussed accurately: who should act, where to attack, such as responding to the inevitable violence of you. There was a clear understanding that the rebellion would not be a simple revolt, but a coordinated and strategic movement. The information was passed from mouth to mouth, such as an underground current of resistance that grew in strength and number. Vesey, a man of vision and patience, understood that for each action there should be a well-calculated reaction. He used his experience as a carpenter to build secret compartments in the trusted houses, where weapons and supplies were stored. The wood that had once used to lift the oppressive walls now became an ally in the struggle for freedom. The conspiracy was not only a matter of physical strength, but also of psychological manipulation. Vesey and his allies planted seeds of doubt and fear among you, taking every opportunity to undermine your trust. They knew that the true strength of an oppressor was in the minds of the oppressed, and by breaking this illusion, freedom became more palpable. However, with every step they took, the risk increased. Spies and informants surrounded, and the price of betrayal was death. Vesey knew he couldn't blindly trust, for the slightest slip could mean the end of everything. The tension was constant, a rope stretched to the fullest, about to break at any moment. But it was this tension that also fed the determination of the enslaved, who refused to accept a destination of eternal submission. The city of Charleston, with its opulent mansions and cobblestone streets, was a chessboard, where each movement was crucial. Vesey, as a strategist master, moved his pieces accurately, always a step ahead of his enemies. He knew time was against them, but he also knew the story favors the brave. And so, under the cloak of the night, while the port of Porto brought the smell of the sea and the promise of freedom, Denmark Vesey continued to mobilize an army of enslaved. They were more than numbers. They were men and women determined to fight for a future that seemed impossible. The conspiracy was a growing flame, about to turn Charleston into a battlefield where justice and freedom could finally triumph. The night was wrapped in a cloak of dark darkness, while the winds of the port whispering secrets of freedom. Inside a small wooden cabin, in the trembling light of a candle, Denmark Vesey and his allies drew a map that not only traced streets and alleys, but also a way to freedom. The smell of burning wax was strong, mingling with the bittersweet odor of the gathered men's sweat, each with eyes sparkling determination. The plan was bold, perhaps even insane, but it was the only way they saw before you. Charleston, with his imposing mansions and cobblestone streets, would be the scene of his revolution. The idea was simple in his brutality: to take the city, to eliminate the slave lords, and then to escape to Haiti, where freedom had already triumphed. Vesey, with the accuracy of a born strategist, outlined every step of the plan, his calloused hands moving, if confident about the parchment. The past nights watching, listening, and planning culminated in that conspiracy. The attack would begin with a Sunday dawn when you would be more vulnerable, relaxed in their religious rituals. The sound of church bells would be the sign for the beginning of the rebellion, a cruel irony that was not unnoticed by Vesey. As you prayed for their souls, the slaves would rise to claim their lives. The first wave of attack would be directed to the city's arsenals. Peter Poyas and his men, with fierce determination, would be responsible for capturing weapons and ammunition, transforming the power of oppressors against themselves. Poyas's view, with his steel gaze, gave everyone confidence around him. He was a man of action, but also with words that urged courage in every shy heart. At the same time, minor groups of combatants would attack the mansions of the most powerful families, eliminating lords and freeing slaves. The order was clear. There would be no mercy for those who had perpetuated so much suffering. Vesey knew that violence would be inevitable, but saw it as a necessary evil to achieve a greater good. Each blow, every shot, would be a statement that oppression would no longer be tolerated. The city, once taken, would be just the beginning. The fleet of small boats, hidden along the coast, would be ready to transport the freed to Haiti, a land of promises and hope where slavery had already been overthrown. The salty smell of the sea would be the aroma of freedom, carrying them to a new destination, free from the invisible currents that had imprisoned them for so long. For Vesey, the escape plan was as crucial as the rebellion itself. He knew that the victory in Charleston would only be temporary if they could not escape before the reinforcements of the neighboring states arrived. Efficiency and speed was essential, and Vesey had the experience of sailors among her followers to navigate the treacherous waters to Haiti. However, the execution of the plan depended on an element that Vesey could not completely control: the loyalty of his compatriots. The possibility of betrayal was an ever-present ghost, prowling each clandestine meeting. Vesey, with a heavier look every day, knew that the slightest failure could be fatal. He trusted his men, but he also knew that the fear and promise of rewards could corrupt to the purest heart. As the uprising date was approaching, the tension between the conspirators increased. The meetings became more frequent, the the most detailed instructions, and the most intense determination. The heat of expectation was almost unbearable, but it was also what kept the flame of the lit rebellion. Vesey, with his unqualified spirit, did not let fear dominate him. He was a man on a mission, moved not only by his personal desire for justice, but for the promise of freedom to all who had suffered so much. In that wooden cabin, Charleston's fate was being decided. Every board that rangs under the weight of the gathered men seemed to murmur in agreement with their bold plan. Time was a double-edged sword, cutting both for hope and destruction. But Vesey knew that regardless of the result, he had done what was needed. He had given his view of a world where freedom was not just a distant dream, but a reality within his hands. And so, with the sound of waves breaking softly on the coast and the promise of a new dawn on the horizon, Denmark Vesey and his allies prepared to take a step that could change the course of history. The rebellion was not just an attempted escape, but a war against injustice. The attack on Charleston would be devastating, not only in its execution, but in its meaning. It was a call to freedom, a last dance of intertwined despair and hope, about to unfold under the awareness of the world. The darkness of the night involved Charleston as a heavy cloak, drowning the sounds and whispers that used to echo through the cobblestone streets. However, on that specific night, the silence was broken by a different sound, a hurry of hasty steps and whispered voices that moved suspiciously. Denmark Vesey's meticulously planned conspiracy was about to face his most severe test, a test that no strategic planning could predict: betrayal. Within the shadows, where conspirators used to gather, an invisible tension oscillated in the air. Vesey's house, which was once a sanctuary of hope and resistance, now seemed a place of uncertainty. The betrayal had been planted as a poisonous seed, growing up in the hearts of someone who had promised loyalty, but whose courage had been suffocated by fear or ganonial thee. The plan, which seemed infallible in its audacity, was about to be exposed to the enemy. The news of the betrayal came to Vesey abruptly, as a dagger drilling his confidence. A murmur, a confession stammered by one of his own, warned him that you were aware of the uprising. The traitor, whose name was lost in the story, had revealed crucial details in exchange for promises of freedom and rewards. The weight of this revelation fell over Vesey like a sledgehammer, crushing his hopes and spreading panic among the conspirators. The reaction was immediate. You now alerted gentlemen have wasted time to mobilize their strengths. The city of Charleston, who was sleeping under the apparent tranquility of the night, was suddenly awakened by the sound of marching boots and doors being broken into. The soldiers, with faces hardened by the determination of maintaining the slave order, invaded the houses, dragging suspects out of their beds, chastising them without mercy. Vesey, with the experience and cunning that had accumulated over the years, tried to regroup her allies, but chaos had already settled. Confidence had been broken, and the fear of new traitors paralyzed many who were ready to fight before. Every corner of the city seemed to have eyes, and each shadow whispered the possibility of an accusing finger. Vesey's arrest was a devastating blow to all who had fed the hope of freedom. He, who was a symbol of resistance and courage, was now handcuffed, treated with the same brutality he had tried to fight. The sound of the currents involving their wrists was a cruel echo of the past that he had so fought to leave behind. In prison, Vesey was surrounded by known faces, men who had been his conspiracy companions. The smell of sweat and fear impregnated the air, mixed with the metal odor of the blood of those who had resisted the capture. Looks were exchanged in silence, each reflecting the pain and indignation of a broken dream. The interrogations were brutal. The slaveholders, determined to eradicate the threat by the root, used all means to extract information. The sound of screams of pain echoed through the dark corridors of prison, each crying out a desperate attempt to protect others. Vesey, however, remained firm, her unwavering loyalty even under the most intense pressures. The news of the arrests spread rapidly through Charleston, generating a climate of terror and distrust. The city, which for a brief moment had felt the possibility of a change, was now plunged into fear and repression. You reinforced their vigilance, and any sign of resistance was crushed with even greater violence than before. For many, betrayal was a cruel reminder of the fragility of hope under the regime of oppression. Vesey, who stared at her cell with a mixed look of despair and determination, knew that despite the failure of the uprising, the flame of freedom could not be completely extinct. He had planted seeds of resistance, and even if he could not see his blossom, he believed that one day justice would prevail. Denmark Vesey's arrest and his allies marked a moment of despair, but also of renewed determination. For those who survived, conspiracy was not an end, but a chapter in the continuous struggle for freedom. The betrayal may have interrupted his plan, but could not erase the unqualified spirit of those who refused to be defined by chains. As the sun was born on Charleston, dyeing the sky with colors of fire and blood, the city woke up to a reality where freedom had been postponed, but not forgotten. The voices of those who had been silenced echoed in the hearts and minds of all who longed for justice. And so, Denmark Vesey's story was still told, not as a failure, but as a reminder that the struggle for freedom is eternal and immortal. Charleston's suffocating heat seemed to further intensify the atmosphere of tension and desperation that hovered over the city. The streets, formerly the scenario of clandestine meetings and whispered conspiracies, were now marked by the oppressive presence of the forces of the order. The judgment of Denmark Vesey and his companions had become the morbid spectacle that the slave masters expected. It was a public demonstration of power, a clear message that any attempt to subversion would be crushed without mercy. The court was packed, its walls drowned out by the smell of sweaty bodies, and the palpable tension of a crowd eager to see the justice of the oppressors was imposed. The sound of the hammer of the judge echoed like thunder, silenced the restless murmurs of the audience. Denmark Vesey, with his handcuffed wrists and firm eyes, was taken to the defendant's bench. His eyes, still full of a relentless determination, traveled the crowded hall, finding Rost family members and enemies equally. The trial was a scam from the beginning. The decision had already been made long before any testimony was presented. The slaves needed a scapegoat, and Vesey, with his leadership and charisma, was the perfect target. Each accusation was an attempt to dehumanize it, to transform it into an example to be feared. The prosecutor, with a voice that was drafting, weaved a narrative where Vesey was the archetype of the dangerous rebel, someone who had dared to challenge the natural order of things. Witnesses were called one by one, many of them forced to testify under threat or bribery. Their reports were distorted, true fragments mixed with carefully manufactured lies to feed fear and indignation from the audience. The accusations were described with vivid details, each word an attempt to paint Vesey and his mates as monsters, not as men who fought for freedom. Denmark Vesey heard everything in silence, his face a mask of determination and calm. Inside, he burned with indignation, but knew he could not show it. His eyes, however, were fierce, like flames that refused to be erased. He knew that even in the defendants, he still had a role to play. His presence there was a silent challenge to the system that tried to destroy him. When Vesey's turn was time, the court dived into an expectant silence. He stood up with dignity, his shoulders raised as if carrying the weight of all who supported him. His voice, when he broke the silence, was firm and clear. He did not beg for mercy, did not ask for mercy. Instead, he spoke of freedom, justice, and inalienable dignity of every human being. His words were sharp, cutting the air like blades, and for a brief moment, even the most severe detractors seemed hesitated. The sentence, however, was inevitable. The word guilty resonated in court, sealing the fate of Vesey and many of his companions. The death sentence was a public spectacle, an execution designed to stifle any future rebellion idea. The verdict was received with a mixture of applause and murmurs, the multitude divided between the relief of seeing the restored order and the concern of knowing that men were being condemned for fighting for a just cause. In the morning of execution, the rising sun tinged the sky with a blood red, as if nature itself cried by imminent spill. The forces, raised in the public square, were a cruel reminder of fate that awaited the disobedient. The damned were taken one by one, their heavy steps echoing in the wooden wood. Vesey, with unshakable dignity, walked with his head up, refusing to give in to fear or humiliation. The sound of the rope's ranger and the acre smell of the linen mingled with the murmur of the crowd. Each face in the audience was a story of complicity or resistance, fear or hope. Vesey, with her eyes fixed on the horizon, seemed to transcend that moment, her mind turning to the legacy she would leave. Around him, his companions awaited his destiny with silent courage, his hands intertwined in a gesture of final solidarity. When the lever was pulled, the silence that followed was deafening. The bodies hung inert, shadows of men who had dared to dream freely. But although their lives had been reapted, the idea that Vesey Planera could not be extinguished. He had become a martyr, a symbol of resistance that would echo through the generations. Denmark Vesey and his companions paid the maximum price for their boldness, but in their deaths, they sowed the seeds of a continuous struggle for justice. Charleston, with its streets stained with blood and tears, would be forever a reminder that freedom has a cost, but also an invaluable value. And so, even in death, Vesey continued to inspire those who refused to accept oppression as destination. The story would remind him not as a criminal, but as a hero, a man who, even in the face of the inevitability of death, found true freedom in his conviction. The night had not yet dissipated completely when the first rumors began to circulate through the streets of Charleston. The air was heavy, loaded with the whisper of stories that threatened to destroy the fragile sense of security of slave masters. The conspiracy of Denmark Vesey, now revealed, became a spectrum by haunting every corner of the city, a palpable reminder that the control you believed to have was merely an illusion. In the dimness of mansions, you gathered in muffled rooms, their whispered conversations full of fear and distrust. The smell of tobacco and the sweat of nervousness mingled, creating an oppressive atmosphere. Each of them felt the weight of uncertainty hanging over their heads, like a sword of Damocles are falling. The discovery of the conspiracy had destroyed the facade of invulnerability they sported, exposing a much more fragile and dangerous reality. The city, once a bulwark of the opulence and slave order, was now immersed in a constant warning state. The betrayal had shown that the threat was not just in the shadows, but could emerge from anywhere, even from the homes themselves. The confidence, which was once a currency among you, was now corroded by doubt. Each slave, each employee was seen with new eyes, suspected of being accomplices of a lift that almost destroyed them. You, many of them used to dictate the lives and fate of hundreds, now felt the bitter taste of fear, a thrill that they rarely experienced. The sound of laughs and songs that once filled the nights in the mansions was now replaced by tense silences and locked doors. The parties and banquets, once symbols of their domain, gave way to stealth meetings where the main dish served was paranoia. The echo of the steps of increased patrols resonated through the streets, the sound of the boots against the cobblestone a constant reminder of the surveillance needed to maintain order. Security forces, inflated by the urgency of the situation, were relentless in their search for any remnants of challenge. Repression and retaliation became slogans, and any evidence of insubordination was crushed with brutal force. Fear was a weapon that cut in all directions, hurting both oppressors and the oppressed. Among you were those who tried to rationalize the danger, attributing the rebellion to a minority influenced by external ideologies. For them, it was inconceivable that slaves, seen as inferior, could architect such revolt. Others, however, recognized the truth that Vesey had tried to show. Continuous oppression could not be kept indefinitely. These few, albeit reluctant, began to consider that changes would be inevitable, although they were crushed by the majority pressure to maintain the status quo. In the confines of the vast properties, you watched their slaves with increasing distrust. For them, each gesture was analyzed, each word heard with suspicion. The hierarchy that previously seemed unshakable now trembled under the weight of uncontrollable fear. These men, who had built their empires about the pain and suffering of others, now faced the spectrum of their own vulnerability. Fear among you did not limit itself to Charleston's borders. He spread like an uncontrollable fire by the southern states, leading other owners to reinforce their own defenses, fearing that the rebellion flame could spread. Meetings were summoned, alliances were formed, and more severe laws were proposed to ensure that such a conspiracy could never flourish again. However, even in the midst of fear and repression, the seed of resistance had been planted. The sacrifice of Vesey and his companions would not be in vain. In the hearts of those who still remained current, the idea of freedom could not be erased, just asleep, awaiting the right moment to resurface with renewed force. The slaves, in their fear, did not realize that the real threat was not in the violence of a lift, but in the idea of freedom he represented. And so, as they cowered in their mansions, surrounded by riches that now seemed empty, the spirit of resistance continued to grow, invisible but relentless, waiting patiently for the day when justice would finally prevail. Fear, an emotion they used to impose, was now their prison, a chain they themselves had forged. And while Charleston City resumed his daily routine, the echo of Denmark Vesey's invisible currents and his followers continued to resonate, reminding everyone that the struggle for freedom never dies, only turns, adapting until it can one day fully triumph. The city of Charleston, after the execution of Denmark Vesey, was unable to return to its old normality. The streets, once moved by a daily life that masked oppression, now seemed devoid of soul. Public execution, planned to be an intimidation spectacle, eventually became an act of martyrdom that reverberated beyond the city's borders. Vesey's sacrifice was not in vain. He had planted an indestructible seed in the heart of the oppressed, a seed that would flourish in resistance and hope. In the months that followed his death, Vesey's story spread like an uncontrollable fire through southern slave communities. Every account of his courage, every detail of his determination in the face of death was shared and recounting in respectful whispers, often at night, around bonfires or campos when the forefront were out of sight. Vesey became a symbol, a living legend that inspired all those who dreamed of freedom. The legend of Denmark Vesey was not limited to slaves. He also encouraged abolitionists who saw an example of resistance and courage. In northern cities where the abolition gained strength, its history was told in meetings and sermons, inciting listeners to unite in the cause for the liberation of all slaves. Articles were written, distributed leaflets, and his name became synonymous with struggle for justice. Vesey's strength was in his ability to see beyond his chains, to imagine a world where everyone was free. This view of freedom was a guidelight for many who were still trapped in the darkness of slavery. Even in death, he continued to lead, his memory a lighthouse that illuminated the way to emancipation. With each attempt at rebellion, with each resistance act, his spirit seemed to be present, encouraging the oppressed to persist. Vesey's influence extended beyond the U.S. borders. Even in the Caribbean colonies, where the echoes of revolts and rebellions were constant, their history found resonance. In places like Haiti, where slavery had already been abolished, Vesey was seen as a fighting brother, and his memory was honored as part of a global movement for liberation. Within the United States, Vesey's memory fueled a growing movement that would culminate decades later in the American Civil War. The struggle for the abolition of slavery found in its history a powerful example of what was possible when the determination was combined with courage. Those who marched alongside iconic figures such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman carried Vesey's spirit, a constant reminder that freedom was a right that it was worth fighting. As the years passed, the city of Charleston could not forget the man who almost shook her until the foundations. For slaves, Vesey was a hero, a visionary who gave them a reason to believe in a better future. For slaves, he was a constant reminder that oppression could not last forever. The fear he instilled in them never really left them, even after his death. They reinforced their security measures, but could not erase the idea that Vesey had planted. Denmark Vesey's legacy was more than a simple attempt at revolt. It was a statement that freedom cannot be contained forever. He showed that even when crushed, the human spirit can rise, stronger and more determined. His story continued to be passed from generation to generation, every new mouth that told her by adding a little hope and courage to the account. Vesey became a mythical figure, a symbol of resistance that transcended his own time. For many descendants of the slaves, the name of Denmark Vesey was whispered in prayers and songs, an invocation of strength and resilience. He was part of a resistance lineage, an unbreakable chain of courage that would continue until freedom was finally reached. Even today, the name of Denmark Vesey resonates in the hearts of those who still fight against oppression in their many forms. Its history is a testimony of the power of determination and justice. And as long as there are those who rise against injustice, Vesey will live, not only as a martyr, but as an eternal hero in the struggle for freedom. He reminds us that true freedom is not given but conquered, and that each generation has the responsibility to fight so that those who come later can live in a world where equality and justice prevail.